Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Deep Dive. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our future deep dives. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's super important, whether you're prepping for those UPSC exams or just someone who, wants to grasp how global finance really works.
It's a topic that often pops up in the headlines, especially when economies hit a rough patch.
Yeah, for sure. And today we're going to be diving deep into the International Monetary Fund, better known as the IMF.
It's an institution with a lot of history and complexity behind it, a lot more than people realize.
Okay, so picture this. It's 1944. The world's still kind of reeling from the Great Depression.
Still recovering.
Yeah. And leaders from 44 nations, they all gather in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Not exactly a vacation spot, right?
Not at all. They had a very serious mission to, build a new global financial order, one that would prevent another economic catastrophe like the Great Depression.
Right, because no one wants to go through that again.
Yeah, exactly.
And out of that gathering, the IMF is born.
Like a phoenix from the ashes, right?
Yeah, I like that. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes of financial chaos. But it wasn't just about creating a global lender.
Right. Right from the get-go, they envisioned the IMF as this financial architect, kind of setting the rules of the game for global trade and currency exchange.
So preventing countries from constantly devaluing their currencies to gain an edge in exports.
Exactly. They were trying to avoid a situation where everyone's trying to undercut each other and it just leads to a race to the bottom where everybody loses in the end.
Makes sense, yeah.
The IMF aimed to make exchange rates more stable, kind of fostering trust and cooperation in global trade. This is what we call the regulatory function, and it's still a core part of what the IMF does.
Got it. So we've got the rule-setting part down, but of course the IMF is, I think, most famous for its loans, right? Those bailouts for countries facing a financial crisis when their economies are on the brink?
Yeah, it steps in. But it's not just about throwing money at the problem. These loans, they often come with conditions.
Ah, so it's not just a free pass. Kind of like a doctor prescribing medicine, but also telling you to change your lifestyle to fix the root cause of an illness.
Exactly. It wants to see countries taking steps to actually fix the problems that led to the crisis in the first place. Often these conditions involve things like cutting government spending or raising taxes or opening up markets to foreign investment.
The goal being to, regain economic stability, get back on track.
Precisely.
It sounds like a pretty powerful position to be in, though, right? Dictating economic policy to entire nations.
It does, but we often overlook another important aspect of the IMF, its consultative role. They provide expert advice and technical assistance to member nations. They share best practices and help them craft sound economic policies, even when those countries aren't in a full-blown crisis.
So it's kind of like having a team of seasoned economic advisors on call.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for developing countries, that kind of expertise can be extremely valuable.
Okay, so we've talked about the rule setting and the loans. To really understand how the IMF works, though, we need to look at its, financial toolbox.
Yeah.
One of the most basic concepts here is quotas. Can you break that down for us? What are these quotas all about?
Think of it like a membership fee. Every member country contributes a certain amount of money to the IMF. The size of that contribution, the quota, it's based on the country's economic size and influence.
So the bigger your economy, the bigger your quota, the more money you put in. But it's not just about money in a pot, right?
No. These quotas actually determine a country's voting power within the IMF.
So the more you contribute, the bigger say you have in how the IMF is run, what policies it follows. I'm guessing this is where it starts to get a little controversial.
You got it. Because it means countries with larger economies, they wield more influence. It's not exactly a level playing field.
Ah, so we're starting to see those power dynamics come into play. But before we dive into that debate, I am curious about another tool the IMF uses. These things called special drawing rights, or SDRs.
Ah, yes, SDRs. They're really interesting because they aren't really a currency, not in the traditional sense. Think of them more like an international reserve asset.
Okay.
It's a claim on the currencies of the IMF member countries.
So like a special voucher, one that can be exchanged for a mix of major currencies, like the dollar, the euro, the yen.
Exactly. And the value of an SDR is determined by a basket of currencies. It's periodically adjusted to reflect the shifting weights of the global economy.
Okay, so SDRs add another layer of complexity to how the IMF operates. Let's bring this back to India, though. India, obviously a major player on the world stage, must have a pretty interesting relationship with the IMF.
Oh, for sure. It goes all the way back to India's independence. In those early years, India received loans to help stabilize its economy and navigate the challenges of being a newly independent nation.
Yeah, and I remember reading about India turning to the IMF during the 1970s oil crisis. That was a period of intense economic pressure globally, right?
Yeah, it was. So it's been a relationship with its ups and downs, for sure. But over time, India's role within the IMF has really evolved. Today, it's the eighth largest shareholder.
Wow, eighth largest. That's huge. Really speaks to India's growing economic clout. But knowing what we know now about the quota system and those power imbalances, it makes you wonder how much influence a country like India actually has.
Yeah, that's a crucial question, and it's one we should definitely explore further because there's a recent IMF report that really made headlines in India, and it raises some interesting points about India's economic trajectory, especially compared to its neighbors.
You're talking about the report that said Bangladesh surpassed India in per capita GDP. That definitely got people talking. And I think it's the perfect place for us to pick up after a quick break. Stay with us.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about this IMF report that compared India's economic performance to Bangladesh's.
Yeah, the one where Bangladesh overtook India in per capita GDP. It really grabbed everyone's attention.
It did, but we have to remember that per capita GDP doesn't tell the whole story. It's just the average income per person.
Right. It doesn't factor in things like income inequality or the overall quality of life in those countries.
Exactly. So it's a data point worth noting, yeah, but it's not like the final word on either country's economic success.
Okay, so it raises some interesting questions for sure, like what led to Bangladesh's rapid economic growth? And what challenges are holding India back in terms of its per capita GDP?
Well, the report highlighted a few key things about Bangladesh. They've had consistent economic growth for a good number of years now, driven by their garment industry, remittances from workers abroad, and strategic investments in things like education and healthcare.
And for India?
India has seen significant overall GDP growth, but factors like population growth and uneven development across different regions that could be impacting the per capita GDP figures.
So it's not just about the total wealth generated, but how it's distributed among the population.
Right. And this comparison with Bangladesh actually highlights a bigger trend. We're seeing the rise of new institutions that are challenging the dominance of the IMF and the World Bank.
You mean organizations like the BRICS Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank?
Exactly. These institutions are offering alternative sources of financing and development assistance, especially for developing countries. And it's changing the game.
So it's not just about who has the most money anymore, but also whose interests are being served and what models of development are being promoted.
Precisely. And it all leads to this crucial question about the future of the IMF. Can it adapt to the realities of the 21st century? Can it stay relevant in a world where countries have more options?
Especially with all the criticism surrounding the IMF, right? The quota system, the voting power dynamics, the whole debate about whether their lending practices, while aiming to promote stability, sometimes come with conditions that can be a real burden for the countries receiving those loans.
Yeah, and there's the argument that the IMF, despite some efforts at reform, still operates with the very Western-centric view of economic development.
So it sounds like the IMF is at a crossroads.
It really does. To maintain its influence, it's got to grapple with these issues head-on: representation, effectiveness, and legitimacy.
Big challenges. But before we get too deep into the big picture questions, can we circle back to India for a moment? We know it's the eighth largest shareholder, but what does that actually mean in terms of influence? What are some of the specific things India advocates for within the IMF?
Okay, so India has been a strong voice for reform within the IMF, especially when it comes to the quota system. They want to give developing countries a greater say.
So not just accepting the way things are, but actively trying to reshape the IMF.
Exactly. And India's also been pushing for the IMF to be more flexible with its lending conditions, acknowledging that developing countries face a whole range of unique challenges.
So it's like India's walking this tightrope, trying to leverage its position within the IMF to push for change, but at the same time, still benefiting from the IMF's resources and expertise.
A very delicate balancing act. And it really speaks to the complexities of navigating these global financial institutions. But there's another layer to this that's worth considering. While India is pushing for these reforms within the IMF, they're also engaging with these alternative institutions we talked about, the BRICS Bank and the AIIB.
So not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Exactly. It's a strategic approach. By engaging with both the established institutions and the emerging ones, India is diversifying its options, making sure it has access to different sources of funding.
Smart. But we've been talking a lot about the IMF at this high level, the history, the functions, the controversies. What does all of this mean for the average person? How does the IMF's work, all this financial stuff, how does it actually touch people's lives?
That's the most important question. It's easy to get lost in the abstract world of finance, forget that real people are affected by these decisions.
Right. We're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet here. Jobs, livelihoods, access to healthcare and education, the things that actually determine people's quality of life.
And that's why understanding the IMF and what it does is so important. The IMF's decisions, their lending practices, the conditions they put on loans, it all has a ripple effect that's felt in communities all over the world.
So even if we're not directly involved in international finance, the IMF's actions can indirectly have a huge impact on our lives.
Absolutely. And this is especially true for countries that depend heavily on IMF loans or whose economies are closely tied to the global financial system.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. It really highlights the importance of not just understanding how the IMF works, but also thinking about its broader impact on everyday people.
And that's why it's so crucial that we're having informed discussions about the IMF, debating its role, its strengths and weaknesses, and holding it accountable for its actions.
Well said. So we've been talking about how the IMF's actions, have this ripple effect across the world, impacting people far removed from, like, the world of high finance.
Right. And it's important to remember that the IMF itself isn't this, monolithic, all-powerful entity.
Yeah, for sure.
It's made up of member countries. And each country, well, they have their own interests and priorities.
Right. It's not just this faceless institution dictating terms from on high. There's internal debate, pushing and pulling, compromises. It's actually kind of a political process in a way.
Exactly. And that's really where the whole issue of reform comes in. We talked about the quota system, the voting power dynamics. These are areas where a lot of people argue that the IMF really needs to evolve.
Yeah, to become more representative, more responsive to the needs of developing countries.
Precisely. And to be fair, the IMF has made some reforms over the years. The 2010 quota reform, for example, it took a long time, but it did lead to bigger quotas for emerging economies and a shift in voting power.
So even within the IMF, there's this acknowledgement that change is needed, right? That the old ways of doing things might not work in the 21st century.
Exactly. But the pace of change, it can be frustrating. And that's where those alternative institutions we discussed, the BRICS Bank, the AIB, well, they offer a different model.
Yeah, maybe one that's more appealing for countries that feel their voices aren't really being heard within the existing system.
It's a bit of a wake-up call for the IMF, I'd say. Like, hey, you need to step up your game if you want to remain the go-to for global financial stability.
Okay, so what would real, meaningful reform look like? What concrete steps could the IMF take to address those concerns about representation, legitimacy, effectiveness?
Well, they got to revisit that quota system,
Got it.
making sure that voting power actually reflects the current global economic landscape.
So giving developing countries a greater say in how the IMF is run.
Yeah, exactly. And beyond quotas, there's the whole question of lending conditions. Are they too strict? Do they actually consider the unique challenges of each country? There's a lot of debate around that.
And maybe they need to be more transparent,
Right.
more open to different perspectives.
Absolutely. That's key. Building trust requires showing a real commitment to, inclusivity and accountability.
It's pretty amazing to think about the IMF in this evolutionary context. It was born from a specific moment in history, right? The ashes of the Great Depression. But the world's a very different place now.
For sure. And the IMF needs to change with it. It needs to adapt, reform itself, prove it's still relevant in a world that's, well, becoming more multipolar.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive into the IMF. The origins, the functions, controversies, challenges, potential for reform.
And it all comes down to this. In our globalized world, we need institutions that can handle the complexities of international finance. The question is, can the IMF evolve to meet the demands of this new era?
That's a question for all of us to consider, really. Whether we're preparing for the UPSC, studying economics, or just, citizens of this interconnected world.
Understanding the IMF, its impact, is absolutely crucial to navigating this global economy, I'd say.
So to wrap up, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
And remember, the future of global finance is something we all have a stake in. Stay informed, stay engaged. Let's keep this conversation going.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our future deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics. Until next time, stay curious.